All right, then we are on live. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for watching us. We are here to host another IBCI event. And we are very glad to have with us Professor Angela Zhang. Professor Angela is an associate professor of law and the director of the Center for Chinese Law at the University of Hong Kong. An award-winning legal scholar, Professor Angela is a highly sought-after commentator on Chinese antitrust issues. Before joining the University of Hong Kong, Professor Angela taught at King's College London and practiced law for 6 years in the United States, Europe, and Asia. Professor Angela received her LLB from Peking University and her LLM, JD and SJD from the University of Chicago Law School. She wrote her doctoral dissertation under the supervision of Judge Richard Posner. And it's not written here, but she just launched a fantastic book about Chinese antitrust law. I have here my friend and Professor Vinicius Klein. Professor Klein and myself would be debaters after the show to be made by Professor Angela. Professor Angela, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a great pleasure to speak in Brazil. And I have prepared some slides for tonight's talk. It's morning for you guys. And let me first share my screen. So my talk today will be about my new book, Chinese Antitrust Exceptionalism. However, I will also use this opportunity to apply some of the insights of this book to what's happening in China, because there have been a lot of things happening with Chinese big tech recently. Even if you're not interested in Chinese antitrust law, you won't miss what's been happening because it's all in the news. So what I mean, Chinese antitrust exceptionalism really stems from what you see here, that there are very strong power imbalances between the government and the businesses, where you see the government clearly has the upper hand. Now, based on my little knowledge about what's happening in Brazil, it seems like the Brazilian society is just the opposite. It seems like the government actually is weaker than the big and powerful businesses. So you can correct me if I'm wrong. So we are actually observing very different dynamics in different countries. But in China, the government is clearly very powerful. Now, and this has implications as to how China regulates, as well as how China is regulated. Now, in terms of how China regulates, because the government is so powerful, the businesses don't dare to challenge the government. We're not even talking about going to court, right? I mean, there's no challenge in the first place, formal or informal, right? I mean, they just immediately cooperate and see to the agency's demand, right? And as a result, the whole administrative enforcement process becomes internalized within the bureaucracy. And that's why it says here that the bureaucratic politics dominates, because without external judicial constraints, then the whole process was about bureaucracy. Then you need to understand how the bureaucracy work. I mean, what are the tacit and the formal rules of the bureaucracy? And that's why bureaucratic politics is extremely important in understanding the whole administrative decision-making process, as well as the dynamics among different actors within the Chinese bureaucracy. And I have to say that this framework does not only apply to antitrust law. You can almost apply to any other areas of administrative law enforcement in China. And that actually is a huge amount of Chinese law, because most of the Chinese laws, I could say that they are enforced not by the judiciary, but by the agencies, right? I mean, especially when you're doing business in China, you need to deal with the agencies, in different level, in different sector, almost on a daily basis, right? I mean, that's why, by reading this book and understanding how the bureaucracy work really helps you to grapple not only with antitrust problems, but basically how you deal with the government. That's a very fundamental and important question to start with. Now, this power imbalances also has implication as to how China is regulated as a target for antitrust regulation. Now, because of this very powerful Chinese government that seems to be able to control everything in China, including the businesses, that gave rise to suspicion from foreign regulators about the independence of these Chinese companies, right? I mean, if none of the companies dare to challenge the government, then foreign governments say, how would I trust your business will operate independent of the government's mandate, right? The irony is that this actually put the Chinese companies in a very vulnerable situation because of the fact that it's hard to assess the scope of these companies, their independence. Then they become vulnerable to foreign regulation. Just think about what's happening to Chinese tech companies like TikTok, and which was almost banned in the United States, like WeChat, right? Almost. Trump also threatened to ban because of all this data issue, that they don't trust that these companies will really safeguard the data of US consumers, right? I mean, because they think that if the Chinese government asks you to turn over data, you're going to turn over data, right? I mean, because you're not truly independent from the Chinese company, you're not going to fight back, right? So this power imbalances also affects how China is regulated. Now, at the same time, there is interdependence between these 2 points. How China regulates affects how China is regulated, because the greater control the Chinese government exerts on its companies, then the more trouble it will bring for its companies overseas. Just think about what's happening to the Chinese tech sector in the past 6 months, which all the tech companies all fall in line and vow to comply with the government's demand. And this actually gives perfect, evidence to foreign government and see, look, see all these companies in China, even including the most powerful private businesses like Alibaba and Tencent, all of them quickly fall in lines. And so that makes foreign governments even more suspicious about the independence of these companies. Now, at the same time, how China is regulated also has implication as to how China regulates, right? I mean, because of globalization, everybody, most countries' economy are tightly integrated with the Chinese economy, being the second largest economy in the world, right? I mean, and soon maybe the biggest economy. And it's really hard not to deal with the Chinese economy. And if foreign regulators take a very aggressive approach into targeting Chinese companies, then China also have leverage over foreign businesses operating in China, right? I mean, so China can potentially retaliate with measures against foreign companies. Like, just think about, Trump is going very harsh against Chinese tech firms, and that prompted the Chinese government to retaliate against US companies using antitrust law or, potentially with other countermeasures. So there's clear regulatory interdependence between these two. Okay, so basically this slide summarizes the whole book. Okay. Now let's start with how China regulates. Now, on April the 10th this year, Alibaba, which is China's biggest e-commerce giant, received a $2.8 billion fine from the Chinese antitrust regulator. And guess how the firm reacted, right? I mean, it thanked the regulator. And in fact, it thanked the regulator for a good reason. You saw on that day, the firm's stock prices actually rebound. I mean, I guess, the investors have predicted even worse, and sort of, so this $2.8 billion fine was better than what they had expected. It could have been worse, right? I mean, and you see the Alibaba's press release that the firm said, we accept the penalty with sincerity and will ensure compliance with determination. And contrast this with Google, right? I mean, which is fighting tooth and nail with the European Commission in Luxembourg, right? I mean, Google is so determined to appeal against every single case. Now, the Alibaba decision is not an exception. Almost all the major companies have either settled with the Chinese antitrust authority, or they've just like, we're disappointed with the decision, but we are not going to challenge the decision. So the question that you may have is like, why don't you challenge, right? I mean, and what adds to further puzzle is the fact that you see since 2014, as I show you here, the Economist report, that there is a significant surge of administrative litigation in China. So you see here, it's actually because in 2014, there was a very big amendment of the Chinese administrative litigation law that makes it easier for plaintiffs to sue the government, for Chinese citizens and businesses to sue the government. So you see a sudden surge of cases in the Chinese court, but you don't see a corresponding trend with antitrust enforcement, right? I mean, so why are so few companies dare to challenge the agency? Now, what I highlight in this book is what I call the strategic shaming strategy, because we are lawyers. I guess the vast majority of the audience here are lawyers, and lawyers tend to focus on the law, right? When you focus on what are the legal penalties, what your clients care about, right? What we tend to overlook is this kind of reputation sanction. Okay, and this is something I actually spent a whole chapter to talk about, this kind of reputation sanction, and what I call strategic shaming strategy. So they don't, when I highlight strategic, I want to emphasize that they don't apply it to every single firm. They don't need to. They just need to set up a few precedents that allow, and that's sufficient to deter companies from challenging the agency. And the way they achieve that is through very smart media strategy. And I will give you an example here. So in 2013, which is one of the early days of Chinese antitrust enforcement, we saw that the NDIC, one of the former antitrust agency, announced on Chinese television that it had been investigating Bill's Time, which is actually a Chinese premium infant formula producer for antitrust violation. Now, the next day, we saw the People's Daily, which is a party mouthpiece, that disclosed the names of a few more companies that were involved in this case. Now, mysteriously, there was 3 other companies that were also investigated at that time, but they were omitted in both the TV and the newspaper. Now, so you see in one single case, the authorities strategically exposed these companies to 3 different levels of publicity. So Bill's Time was the firm that initially tried to launch a vigorous defense against the investigation, right? Maybe in the lawyerly instinct, they wanted to fight against this case. But what happened was that the agency strategically announced investigation and single out this firm in the CCTV news. And what happened in the end? So this firm lost over 1/3 of its market capitalization within 1 week of the agency's announcement. Okay, so at that point, there was 0 penalty imposed yet, right? I mean, they just announced the investigation, but just 1 week, within 1 week, the whole stock market panicked about this company, right? I mean, because how come they were singled out, and that sends a very bad signal to investors, because the investors in Chinese stock, they play a very strong emphasis on the government and business relationship, right? Because they know if you want to succeed and thrive and prosper in China, you need to enjoy good relationship with the government. And the fact that you are singled out in this whole antitrust enforcement just send a very bad signal that you are, you're not doing well with the government. And that's why, all the investors of this company just panic. So within 1 week, this firm lost 1/3 of its market cap, right? I mean, And even though at the end, this company also received a very hefty antitrust fine, but that market capitalization loss was more than 20 times higher than the final antitrust penalty. So what this firm was really worried about, they should not worry so much about the antitrust penalty fine, which is millions of dollars, but it was the reputation damage that they could inflict, right? I mean, and these are the very early cases that set up a very good precedent for future players. And on the other hand, those companies like this gentleman is from Wire, which is an executive from an infant formula manufacturer, and he actually went on TV with a bunch of the antitrust enforcers, saying that how they cooperate with the agency very quickly and submitted all the documents that they require. And Wire actually received zero. They have received complete leniency, no penalty from agency. So you see, so this kind of precedent set up a very strong, this case set up a very strong and powerful precedent for future companies to know, and also for lawyers, right? I mean, who advise the client and said, look, if they come, why don't you just quickly cooperate? Because that will lead to a much better outcome than if you fight. There's a good chance that they might, even applied media as a strategic tool to shame the firm, which could lead to huge repercussion of loss. Now we see similar strategy that is applied to Alibaba, which we just talked about. So on Christmas Eve last year, the Chinese Antitrust Authority posted a very short one-sentence announcement that it had been investigating Alibaba and for the choose one from two exclusionary antitrust practices. And now 10 minutes later, the People's Daily, the People's Net publish a commentary seemingly prepared in advance, right? I mean, in 10 minutes, and endorsing the agency's investigation, and then see how the market reacted. On that day, Alibaba stock dropped by 13%, which wiped out over $100 billion market capitalization. Okay, so it's $100 billion. So compared with the $2.8 billion, that was nothing, right? I mean, so that was my point here, that the reason they do it, I think, is deliberate, right? Because in the agency has been set up, this new agency has been set up since 2018. This is the first time they ever post an announcement on this website announcing that they're investigating a firm, because they know, they are well aware that this kind of news, negative news, will cause severe damage to a publicly listed companies. And that will be a very strong penalty on the firm. So in the vast majority of cases, they don't do that. And this is the first time they did that, right? I mean, they're also doing it to Meituan, which is a company that they are investigating right now. Now, for those of you who are listening right now, would be saying, look, the Chinese government seems so powerful, and it seems like it's the agencies can do whatever they want. And that's completely false. Well, what happened is, even though these agencies, they are seldom subject to challenge, they do operate with a lot of constraints. And there are two major constraints here. One is the capacity constraint. They have very few people. They just have a very small capacity to start with. The other important constraint is the bureaucratic constraint, because they work within the bureaucracy, so they need to play by the rules of the bureaucracy. And this bureaucratic constraint is what I refer to the phenomenon called power fragmentation within the bureaucracy, because each bureaucracy have a very dedicated scope of responsibility. So inevitably, there could be overlapping duties with other bureaucratic departments, right? And because the work is divided according to function or according to sector. So say, for instance, in the internet sector, there could be like 10 or 20 different bureaucratic departments simultaneously could be in charge of, specific issue. And that's what I call, this kind of Chinese styles of checks and balance, right? I mean, because very often these agencies have overlapping jurisdiction over a regulatory matter, right? So they need to work with each other. And that, in effect, creates constraints and becomes another form of checks and balance. But it's very different from the Western styles of checks and balance. Now, so how did we decide, how do we figure out how these agencies operate? One of the most important thing I want to highlight in my book is that each of the agencies, they have very different mission, they have very different culture, they have very different structure because they all have their own history, right? I mean, if you look at the Chinese antitrust enforcement in the first decade, you see we actually had 3 different administrative agencies at that time, and they do things very differently. And this all goes back to the mission, culture, and structure problem. So in order to understand how they behave, you really need to understand these 3 points, because that will affect how they form their enforcement agenda, how they decide to investigate cases, as well as how what will be the final regulatory outcome. Now, just go back to the example of the investigation of Chinese big tech. So after the imposition of the $2.8 billion fine on Alibaba, the Chinese regulators summoned 34 tech firms, including Alibaba, for a meeting, or what we call administrative interview in China, which is a kind of informal meeting between the regulator and the firms, and the regulator make a series of demand on these companies that you need to improve compliance. And you see the regulator not only ask these companies to improve antitrust compliance, which is what the Alibaba case is about, but also with many other things. And these other things actually fall within its enforcement mandate, right? I mean, I give you an example of the commitment letter from one of the tech firm who attended the meeting was from JD, which is the fierce competitor of Alibaba. And in the commitment letter, you can tell, the firm vowed to comply with antitrust law, but also consumer protection law, e-commerce law, advertising law, price law. All these laws fall within the mandate of the current ministry that housed the antitrust authority. So it looks to me that this ministry is trying to leverage its antitrust function to enhance its power in enforcing other areas of market regulation. So basically, they're trying to use the Alibaba case to give themselves greater leverage to expand their policy control. And that reinforced what I just said earlier, that you really need to understand, what the mission of the agency to know where it is coming from. Now, I would want to, after talking about what's happening in China, I want to shift to the international arena to talk about what's happening in the United States and how it affects what will happen in China. So as you know, since 2018, the Chinese companies, particularly Huawei and ZTE, 2 of the prize national champions of China, have been subject to a lot of US sanctions. And Huawei's CFO Meng Wanzhou was also arrested in Canada upon the request from the US Department of Justice. And of course, there are seemingly legitimate reasons to go after these companies, but at the same time, one can also interpret these cases. There is another very plausible interpretation that these cases were targeting at the best and most successful Chinese tech companies to undermine China's rise, right? And because the US executive branch does have a lot of discretion in going after foreign executives and businesses, and on the basis of the so-called long-arm jurisdiction, right? I mean, that allows the US government to arrest people, extraterritorially, and even those conduct seemingly does not have a clear nexus with the US. And that prompted the Chinese policymakers and lawmakers to think about what we can do. I mean, what kind of laws that we have in China that can counter this kind of foreign sanctions. And they look around and they realize we don't have this type of tools, right? I mean, And then they found, look, antitrust law could be one of them, because antitrust could also allow a government to exert extraterritorial control over foreign business transactions, right? I mean, just give an example. When Qualcomm wanted to acquire NXP, so Qualcomm is a US technology company and want a semiconductor firm that want to acquire another semiconductor firm from the Netherlands, right? And that deal was notified to 9 jurisdictions, including China, and obtained clearance from 8 jurisdictions. And China was the only one that held up this deal. So China didn't block the deal, but strategically held up this deal. So the party was just waited and then decided, oh, we're not going to get it. So they gave up. And one can also understand, quite easily guess the reason why China did not want this deal to go through, because you see later, when Cisco wanted to acquire Acacia, that deal was similarly held up for a very long time. And similarly, when Applied Materials, which is another American American firm in the semiconductor sector, want to acquire Japanese manufacturer, that deal was similarly held up. And so these 3 deals are in the semiconductor sector, right? I mean, so the Chinese government are holding up these deals precisely in response to the aggressive US sanctions of the Chinese businesses, right? Because they keep banning semiconductor supplies to the Chinese tech firms. So the Chinese government retaliated. I mean, that's my interpretation. They retaliated using antitrust law as a weapon and a countermeasure against those sanctions. So if say in a scenario, if you think the US does not ban these essential supplies and components to Huawei, then the Chinese government would not be so concerned about this further concentration, further acquisitions by the US companies, right? I mean, just imagine if the US companies can aggressively buy out its European and Japanese manufacturers, then that may make the Chinese sourcing of these components even more difficult. Yeah, so that was the major concern of the Chinese government. Now, in addition to holding up mergers, we also see some of the Chinese commentary. For instance, this one from Global Times, which is also a party newspaper, although in English, so it's mostly facing Western audience, that it is threatening to apply anti-monopoly law to investigate US companies in response to those aggressive US sanctions, right? So that's what I'm saying, that in the book, that as Sino-US tensions intensify, we might see a blurred line between antitrust and national security issues. Now, I will spend a lot of time to talk about how China regulates, and let me now move on to how China is regulated, because maybe that's a point that our audience is also very interested, because China is indeed a very active exporter and an investor in Brazil and in Latin America. So since 2008 financial recession, we saw the Chinese companies was very active investing overseas, particularly in Europe. And but recently, this investment trend has receded a little bit because of a series of events that happened in China, and also because of the foreign hostility. But between 2008 until 2018, for that decade, we see a huge explosion of investment flowing outside of China. Okay. And most of this investment were made by the Chinese state-owned firms, right? And because China still have a very large state sector, and these Chinese state-owned firms are so large and so powerful and so deep-pocketed that allows them to make a lot of acquisitions overseas. And the European Commission was concerned about are these companies Trojan horse because they're state-owned firms, or are they really independent individual companies? And when it comes to antitrust law, this question have very far-reaching ramification, because the first question we need to decide when we do merger assessment is that we need to analyze the scope of this company, right? I mean, but if you look at the state-owned firm, I mean, the commission just scratches its head, like, where do I start? I mean, where does it end? And should I see all the Chinese companies as one single firm? all Chinese state-owned firm is one single firm, or what should I do? And then in 2016, when they scrutinized a joint venture between EDF, which is a French state-owned firm, and CGN, which is a Chinese nuclear power company, a state-owned firm. When they're trying to create a joint venture in Hinkley Point that I show you here in the UK, the commission decided in this case for the first time that it will see all the Chinese companies in the energy sector as one single firm. And that has huge impact on not only that case, but also potential other cases. And ironically, it also puts the commission in a difficult position, right? I mean, because if you think that these Chinese companies in the energy sector are one single entity, then arguably the commission should not have jurisdiction to intervene into mergers between Chinese companies in that sector, as well as cartels between the Chinese company in that sector, because that will be deemed internal activities within this firm. Right. I mean, but the commission potentially would have an interest in intervening those cases, right? I mean, just think about during COVID, China played a very important role in exporting its ingredients, those essential medical supplies all over the world, right? I mean, so China's exports, even if in the short term, can potentially have a dominant position in certain area, right? I mean, and if there is indeed an export cartel, the commission may have an interest in intervening in those cases, but it will lose this jurisdiction if it exceeds Chinese companies as one single firm. And that explains why the commission has been actively looking for alternative regulatory tools to deal with Chinese investment. And one thing we need to bear in mind is that at the commission, at the EU level, there is no national security review. There's no EU security review because that power is vested in the national member states. But the member states have very different rules in each state. So in order to tackle this problem, in May this year, the Commission proposed a new regulatory tool to tackle to address anti-subsidy. So basically, if a firm is found to be subsidized by a foreign government and make acquisitions in the EU, then it will be subject to a new merger clearance. And many observers, including those in China, believe that this is specifically targeting Chinese firms because it does give the Commission much more leverage in scrutinizing Chinese deals, whether it involves state-owned firms or private firms, because the Commission is similarly suspicious that Chinese private firms may also be influenced by the Chinese government, right? So, and this tool basically is drafted so vague and so broad, the threshold is so low that will allow them a lot of room to go after any Chinese investments in Europe. Now, as you see, the EU tightened their scrutiny over Chinese company. You see in the United States, the Chinese company has similarly met with tighter antitrust control. As you know, the Chinese, there have been a lot of complaints, particularly from politicians like Trump, that the Chinese supplies are dominating U.S. market. Right, I show you here. You know, China dominates the global steel production, and during COVID, similarly, the U.S. public are very concerned about potential disruption of medical supplies from China because China now controls 97% of the antibiotics supply, right? I mean, because if they don't source, if the U.S. cannot source antibiotics from China, U.S. hospital will be closed within weeks, right? I mean, it will be disastrous for the United States because the U.S. no longer produce those drugs, and simply because China is very cost effective, so they can produce at a very cheap price. So the U.S. producer found it no longer profitable to produce those products, right? In any event, so this gives the Chinese exporters a lot of bargaining power and also potential opportunity to raise prices when they sell overseas. And so it creates the conducive conditions for the formation of cartels. And that explained in the past decades, there have been a lot of Chinese companies that have been sued in the United States for conducting export cartel. And one of the most famous cases involved a group of Chinese vitamin C producers. And that case went all the way up to the US Supreme Court. And in that case, these producers did not deny that they had coordinated prices, but they defended themselves on the basis of foreign sovereign immunity. That is, that it was the Chinese government that compelled them to fix prices because the government was worried if they sell too low, they might be subject to anti-dumping duties, right? Remember, the whole point the Chinese producers were able to dominate the world market was because the prices were cheap, right? I mean, the domestic producers don't want to produce these products, and that's why they was usually met with anti-dumping charges, and that's prompted the Chinese government to set up constraints on these farms, freedom to set price. But then when they fix prices and try to raise it, then they are subject to antitrust charges in the United States, right? I mean, so you see the Chinese company are put in a very difficult position. If they sell low, there will be anti-dumping duties. If they fix and raise prices, then they will be subject to antitrust charges. Okay, so what does that lead us? I did not paint a very rosy picture of China's rise to the global regulatory order, particularly in the area of antitrust. However, I do end my book with a helpful note, with a hopeful note. I hope it is also helpful as well. The basic question that we are faced with is very simple, right? I mean, given the fact of the deteriorating relationship that China has with foreign countries, particularly with the United States, right? I mean, but at the same time, you know, the US companies cannot do without the Chinese market, right? I mean, so in the absence of trust, can US businesses, can US government still deal with China, right? I mean, is there any hope for cooperation? And I want to show you through what we just talked about in the past 30 minutes, right? How China regulates and how China is regulated. I want to show you, there's clear interdependence between these two. And as much as the US businesses are afraid that they are held hostage by the Chinese government, the Chinese companies are similarly afraid that they are held hostage by the US and the European governments, right? Because there's clear incompatibilities between the Chinese businesses and the foreign and the existing regulatory paradigm in the Western jurisdictions, right? So, and you're clearly seeing the trend of this like gradual tightening of scrutiny over Chinese companies. So basically the two sides are sort of exchanging hostage with each other. And this kind of hostage exchange activities, in my opinion, is a good thing because it's precisely because each side have so much leverage over each other that they won't do crazy things, because that is an essential commitment that is conducive to peace. On the other hand, if you think, for instance, if the United States continue to distance China, trying to cut off all the links with China, trying to ban all the Chinese companies into the US market, then gradually the United States will have less leverage over China. And the consequences is that the US businesses operating in China, just think about companies like Qualcomm, think about company like Tesla, these companies will have a much harder time because they no longer can get protection from the government, right? The best protection that they have is that their government also have a lot of Chinese investment on their soil, right? Otherwise, they will be very vulnerable in China. So with that, I end today's presentation. I very much look forward to discussion with you guys, and thank you.
Well, it was really informative and brilliant presentation, Professor Angela. I may say, Angela. Thank you very much.
You.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
At least I learned a lot. Thank you very much. Well, I have some comments and questions, and I will propose, if my friend agrees, I can say the comments and questions, and then I give the floor to Professor Vinicius, and then we can hear Professor Angela again. Okay. So I enjoyed a lot, Angela, and the way you presented, the two poles, looking inside China and looking from the outside, right? How the other jurisdictions, they treat China, and there's a lot of skepticism, and I may say from our side here in Brazil, we have a huge connection to China. I mean, China is far the most investor in Brazil. So this is a fact. Invest a lot higher than US, I must say. So, but we have not much information about China. This is true as well, and we should treat it well, treat it better, learn more about China, because it will strengthen our connection, I must say as well. So my first point, and actually question, is that when you mention bureaucratic politics dominates, and after you develop, but is it technical or more political oriented? Although you mentioned that there is a Chinese checks and balances system, right? I would like to hear your opinion, more political or more technical? And the second one would be, in your opinion, this Alibaba's case, not touching your opinion, actually, I learned from your presentation that this case on Alibaba's antitrust case suggests a highly legitimacy or trust to the Chinese government. Is this perception valid, or in fact, there's no way out? So the player should accept the decision, whatever it is, right? The third point is about Chinese courts. Are the courts really independent from the government, or they rely on the government, so they are not that free to decide against it, right? And the last one actually are split into two questions about media, and because the case of Biostime, very interesting, I may say. So this case suggests to me, at least I have this perception hearing from you, that there is also a high degree of legitimacy or trust, if you may, to the media amongst the Chinese people. So people trust the media. I mean, this is exactly the opposite what happens in Brazil. People don't trust media. There's a battle of fake news all days. But if I learned well, Chinese people, they trust media. Is this true? Who finances the media? Is the government behind the media as well? Or how it works in China? Thank you very much. Vinicius.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Thank you very much. Angela, your presentation was fantastic, as your book, and your academic trajectory is also impressive. And for me that studies competition law and also law and economics, to talk to someone who was supervised by Professor Richard Posner, it's an honor also. And your book is very interesting because you talk about use some tools from like Robert Erickson, from Stigler, but in a competition law that has less room for economic reasoning. As you said in your presentation, there are other factors in antitrust law in China. And it was very interesting to me how you used these concepts to understand the reality from China. And this idea is very interesting to me. One of the best chapters I like it more, was this idea that you regulate by chain. So you could, if the media is from the state and you control the media, it's, if you see like the equation from Gary Becker, like clubs of crime, you must use the most inexpensive sanction, and to just show something in the state media saying that this company is bad is very expensive, and there is no appeal. Even if you make a change in the system and make a change in the judiciary, the damage is done. So it's like a very good solution, I think, if you can control the narrative. As Eduardo said, in Brazil, I think I don't have this control, so it's hard because you have some competing narratives. And another thing that was very interesting to me is this idea of the close community of regulators and their cultures, and this competition between regulators. I think that's because one thing I see when I study state-owned companies in Brazil is something that, since the employees have stability, they cannot be fired by will. They must have like a just cause to fire them. They have a strong culture, a stronger culture than private companies, because a private company has more change in the personal. And I would like to ask you the stability of people that work in Chinese regulators, because I saw that in the beginning of the book you said it was like, for example, one of the guys from one of the agencies that was very good, and he made a good case, so he went to a next level in the hierarchy of the Communist Party or the state. And how this career thinking is important in the Chinese antitrust law. One question. Another question is this thing about hostages. So the multinationals are hostages, and you can try to find balance and cooperation. And how do you think it can work with countries like not United States that don't have like these important companies? Maybe Brazil or other country that has no good hostages to offer to China. Do you think like if Brazil, or maybe a smaller country, if he goes to China and has something like that, like an investigation, and this think about interviews, you said also, presentation in the book, so it's very powerful, because you say, okay, I'm interviewing you, and I'm doing the research, and I'm threatening you to punish. But if you say it's okay, I'm guilty and I'm going to pay the fine, say, okay, thank you, as I said in the presentation, it's better. So just the threat is enough. In that way, if you have this chance of talking, like, this must be a credible threat to work. If you like a very easy game, like you can see that there must be a credible threat. And you said also in the book that there is lots of fragmentation in the power and in the. So, did you see any case that the threat was not real or was not enough, and like the company had more power than the regulator? Because like big companies, I said in China, the balance between state-owned companies are stater, but if you're state-owned companies, there is the problem of losing money and losing you show the share dropping, but it's a little dangerous maybe sometimes for some regulators to do this in big companies. And if how this happens when it goes wrong, because I think most of the cases you showed, the thing went right. Like they threatened, the company said, okay, pay the fine and no problem. And the final question is about the change maybe. And you saw, I think the end of the book, it's good, it's hopeful, as you said, like you can do cooperation by economic integration because multinationals and hostages. But if you try to do like a big reform in China and to do like reform in the administration, like in the judiciary or in the, do you think it can work? Like one day, do you think China wants to or can be more Western style of doing things? Thank you.
Thank you very much, both, for very, very insightful comments and really good questions as well. But you might need to remind me because to first answer the question about how's the bureaucratic politics work, is it technical or political? Yes, yeah, indeed. I think it's more about politics in the sense that bureaucratic politics involve the understanding of the decision-making process, right? I mean, in China, because the top leadership delegates the responsibilities to the technocrats. And so, but at the same time, these technocrats have overlapping duties. So they apply this management model called delegation by consensus. So if all the agencies agree with this point, then it's almost automatically ratified. There's no need for the upper leadership to intervene further. But if these agencies disagree with each other, then the matter may be pushed up to the top. And then at that point, the top leadership will intervene. And there is here a lot of dynamics, right? How do you decide whether you want to cooperate with another agency or not? Then it depends on your own bureaucratic interests as well as your power vis-a-vis the other agency. And also bear in mind that this is a repeated game. So if you don't cooperate this time, then next time when you need their help, they're not going to cooperate with you because you are dealing with each other, very frequently. So it's a really, really complicated dynamics, and I don't have a simple solution to each problem. And we do need to analyze case by case. Now, regarding the Alibaba case, you make a very fascinating point, Ecuador, about, this case seems to show that the government has very high legitimacy because the firm just immediately cooperates, right? I mean, to be fair, this is a long overdue case. The government could have investigated. The agency actually received a complaint from Alibaba's competitor back in 2015. But they didn't really initiate a formal antitrust investigation because they were concerned that might harm innovation and entrepreneurship. So it wasn't until late last year, when the Chinese top leadership decided that, wait, now this is the time for us to go and rein in our big tech, that you see the Chinese antitrust authority finally escalated their actions to initiate a formal antitrust investigation into Alibaba's exclusionary practices. So from that perspective, there is indeed very high legitimacy, but I think the firm's cooperative attitude is more driven by its fear of the government, right? With the fact of the power imbalances, that knowing that it's just no use to challenge the government. And the best strategy in this current situation is to lay low, right? And show your cooperation. And what I want to particularly highlight is that what you observe in the past 6 months that's happening in China is quite different from the antitrust enforcement in the first 12 years. Because in the past, antitrust enforcement was more like a routine enforcement. It was the central leadership, as they're very busy. Antitrust is not on the top agenda of President Xi Jinping, right? I mean, but it was until last fall that you see all of a sudden they become interested in this problem. And this has become a top priority for the government. And then you see the agencies, then the top leadership started to mobilize the whole bureaucracy to start a law enforcement campaign against big tech. So it's not just the antitrust agency, but also other administrative agencies are also closely scrutinizing these companies. So we are in a very different governance model at the moment, because before it was very, very lax, and now all of a sudden it switched to very, very harsh, because we are in the middle of a massive law enforcement campaign, right? I mean, so, and companies are aware that in this climate, when you are in the campaign, you do need to show your cooperation. That's not a point to negotiate and to bargain. You just need to behave, right? I mean, to show that you are willing to comply with their demand. And third, the Chinese court, how independent they are. The Chinese court have been professionalized for the past few decades. You definitely see greater awareness, legal awareness among the judiciary. I would say the quality of the judges higher, could be even higher than the administrative officials, because in order to become a judge in China, you do need to go through a very demanding screening process. However, China is a very vast country, just like the size like Europe, right? I mean, and different provinces have, you know, the level of the judicial quality is very different, right? I mean, if you go to a prosperous province, like in the East Coast, the judges are likely very well educated, very smart, very top of the game. Whereas when you go to places like in the farther remote in the Western areas, then it will be a completely different story. So there is also unevenness among different regions. And but for the most part, you definitely see improvement in the professionalization of the Chinese judiciary. And I have to say, you know, the vast majority of Chinese cases are professionally done. There's no political influence in those cases. However, there will be still continue to be a small minority of cases, that those very important cases that will be influenced, just similar to what you observe with, you know, the administrative enforcement, right? I mean, if you talk to a lawyer who have interacted with the Chinese antitrust, they will say, you know, it's just like other jurisdictions. There's not that much difference. And for the most part, the cases are handled very quickly. The Chinese agency do appear to be very efficient. But when it comes to really big cases, those cases could become political, just like the case I just talked about, the Alibaba case, those Qualcomm cases. When it comes to really important strategic political cases, then you know, this kind of professionalism does take a step back, right? Because there's political loyalty that will override the professional accountability. Yeah, I believe that will be the reality, similar reality with the judiciary as well. And when you talk about the Bilstein case, the media also seems to play a very important role that gives the legitimacy to the Chinese government. And it seems to show the Chinese people do trust the media. It is true that in China, the Chinese people do place bigger trust in the media than say, for instance, Russia, or, you know, maybe in Brazil as well. But at the same time, all the media outlets, whether we are talking the commercial outlets or non-commercial outlets, they're all controlled and censored by the Chinese government very tightly, also including social media platforms, right? And you probably know that the Chinese government installed the Great Firewalls back in the early 2000s that blocked most of the biggest US social media platforms into China. So in China, we only use, you know, WeChat, Tencent's WeChat. We use Baidu instead of, we use WeChat instead of WhatsApp. We use Baidu instead of Google. So we have our own domestic counterparts to what you observe in your countries. And so the government does control, the media very tightly, but at the same time, it doesn't seem to undermine the Chinese confidence in the validity in the Chinese report. However, there will always be skepticisms about what's being portrayed in the Chinese media, knowing that it has been filtered and been subject to censorship. So, for instance, in the Bios Times case, the market reacted so badly, not necessarily because they trust the Chinese government. It's more a reflection of the market's prediction that this firm's relationship with the government has gone sour. That is something that's very valuable to the Chinese investors, that they think, if you lose this asset, this company is going to struggle. And that explains why the market crashed. Now let's move on to Vinicius' question. He's very interested in the shaming. I'm so glad that you mentioned that. And the first question I think you have is about the career of the officials. How would that affect the antitrust enforcement? And you raise absolutely a very important question. In the West, there are very clear revolving doors, especially in the United States, very clear revolving door between the agencies and businesses. We are observing very similar phenomenon happening in China as well. So we are starting to worry about the classic problem of capture, right? If these officials are anticipating that they might move to the private sector, that might distort their incentive in regulating the sector. They might be too lenient to the sector, and that seems to echo what had been happening in the first 10 years of Chinese antitrust enforcement. Why were they so lax in regulating the big tech, right? It appears, at least, with some anecdotal evidence, that these big tech companies have been quite successful lobbying the regulators, and that revolving door opportunities also incentivize the regulators to give a more lenient outcome to their future employer, right? So it is a very important question. So query, for instance, now we are in the middle of a massive regulatory campaign, so there's not much those big tech can do by lobbying. However, what we are concerned about is that when the campaign is over and things return back to the routine, whether the capture will once again, bring the Chinese antitrust enforcement to a very lax stage than what it's supposed to be, right? Because of the continuing revolving door. And now you raise a very important question of what about other developing countries that don't have that many cars to deal with China, like the United States? How are we going to hold hostage of the Chinese companies? Now, I think the best strategy for other developing country, a smaller country, is to go back to multilateralism. Right. But the irony is the United States that want to walk away from the multilateralism, international organizations like WTO, but WTO didn't have any provision dealing with antitrust. But it will be helpful for all countries to agree on some sort of basic principles with antitrust enforcement, that we need to give, at least meet certain standards of transparency, due process, right? That is the kind of pre-commitment that you can constrain China from acting too aggressively or, to potentially discriminate against Brazilian companies, for instance. So this kind of contractual arrangement will be useful. This multilateral arrangement is useful because it also helps smaller countries bound together in the negotiation with bigger country like China. But difficult reality, however, is, when do you think it is realistic for all the countries to go back to the WTO or other types of multilateral negotiations? And even if we go back to the negotiation table, whether antitrust will be discussed, right? I mean, will be on the top priority because in the 1990s, there was at the time some proposal on the table to include antitrust into the WTO framework, but those proposals eventually were aborted. So it wasn't successful in the end. So query whether we can achieve another success this round. And lastly, I think you about the more powerful the regulators. Oh yeah, about whether the regulators can always get their way. That sometimes companies can also be very powerful. And then you also raise a very important question. So when the Chinese regulator deal with the state-owned firms, these state-owned firms are very powerful, right? I mean, these regulators are only at the bureau level, and it's very hard for them to tackle a very large state-owned firm, particularly those centrally owned state-owned firms, and that have very strong bureaucratic support from the governments, including from other sector regulators or the state assets regulator. So back in 2011, when the antitrust agency investigated China Telecom and China Unicom, two of the largest Chinese state-owned telecom companies, they did face a lot of oppositions from within the bureaucracy. So as you read in the book, what they did instead was that they tried to leverage media again to push forward this case. So they actually had been investigating this case for a really long time. And then that everything was kept in secret because they know, this kind of public announcement or this kind of news leakage will cause damage to these two firms. So, but then when they know that it's hard for them to push it forward, then they apply the media strategy by announcing it strategically on the Chinese state television. And that caused these two companies' stock prices to tumble quite a lot. And these are the biggest companies in the world at that time. They were among the top 10 companies in the world. So their stock prices, a small repercussion could lead to huge stake assets loss, right? I mean, so, and eventually these two companies offer some concessions, and the case was suspended. So this is kind of like a compromise that was reached between the regulator and the firms. And this is the only example where I think the regulator did have met with some challenge. And that's when they deal with the powerful state-owned firms. Or one could say, they would have made more challenge if they go after more state-owned firms, but once they do this test case and know how difficult it is, they just discouraged, right? I mean, if there's so much hassle going after state-owned firms, right, I would go after those easier targets, right? I mean, those foreign companies don't have that much leverage to fight against me, right? And lastly, Nisha's asked a question about Chinese judiciary and the Chinese legal system. Could it become more Western? Now, if we take a more dynamic view and historical view of the Chinese legal system in the past few decades, we will see huge improvement. And whether we're talking the judiciary or the administration level, right? I mean, because overall, I mean, the Chinese as a country, Chinese country as a whole has improved a lot. I mean, people have become richer, and when they become richer, they demand better institutional support, including better legal service, right? I mean, then people become more educated, then you have better legal professionals. But at the end of the day, the development of the Chinese legal professions and the whole judicial reform is hampered by the governance model, right? I mean, we don't have this kind of Western styles of checks and balances, and whereas everything is top down. And so agencies, and as well as the court, they obtained their legitimacy from the top leadership. So that's how so their legitimacy actually derived from the top rather than from the bottom, because the government wasn't democratically elected, right? I mean, so they're held, the first thing that held responsible, the first thing they need to think about is how I react to the top, right? I mean, so they are evaluated according to an upward responsibility system. right? I mean, so they're more judged by the political loyalty than the professional performance. And that would sometimes undermine professional judgment, right? I mean, so there will be a small price, though I wouldn't say a small price. I mean, there will be a trade-off within the Chinese government's model that you see even professionals like judges, administrative officials, sometimes when they make the judgment, because they need to be held responsible to the top, they do need to consider these political considerations that might undermine the professional judgment. Just think about what's happening in COVID, right? I mean, those doctors knew the virus was spreading, but they were censored and silenced initially because the local government officials were afraid that if this news leak out, that will create instability in the local region, right? I mean, so the news was suppressed. It wasn't until the central leadership decided to intervene, then decided that we need to crack down and control the virus, that the whole nation was mobilized. So you see that in the Chinese style of governance, there is clear distinct advantage, right? I mean, things can move very quickly because the government being so centralized at the top, it has the power to mobilize all the bureaucratic departments, and things can act very quickly. That's explained why in China they control COVID so well. But they also have its distinct disadvantage, right? I mean, because of the fact that the various government departments, they don't have the independence to make the judgment, right? I mean, they still need to go to the top and ask whether I can release that information. And by the time the information go to the top, there is an information lag, right? I mean, the information transmission takes time. The transaction cost is quite costly. And that time loss could potentially create a crisis. And that's why we see the pandemic. If they were able to exercise professional judgment rather than thinking about the political responsibility, they could have controlled COVID earlier than what had happened. So sometimes it could also lead to disasters, and it comes with very clear advantages and disadvantages. Yeah. And with that, I think I answered most of the questions. Let me know if you have more.
Them, brilliant.
Oh, you answer all the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I find you very generous, Angela. Thank you very much. And it's really interesting to learn about China and how it works. This theme of the moral shame interested me. I think it's a nice idea for us, Vinicius, to go a little deeper into this topic. I just have Angela's book on my screen, the next screen. I promise to keep reading it. And then you can schedule another session, maybe a month or so in the future, to discuss this moral stuff. Very interesting indeed.
Thank you.
And well, we are over an hour and 15 minutes. So I will give the word to you, Vinicius, for final remarks. I say my final remarks now, thanking Angela for this opportunity, this generosity, and Vinicius as well. Please, Vinicius, Angela, and then we can close.
Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you, Angela. Your presentation, your questions were very well responded, very, very good and very impressive. And this is like this thing about, because it's a cheap way of sanctioning companies, just making harm to their reputation. And this is like a very interesting idea. But also this thing about revolving doors, because this thing about what's best for me, to be very hard with companies and go, if this is what the party wants, or top-down reasoning, and be very hard and big fines. And if I threaten in an interview a big fine, it maybe shows that I have already consulted with someone in the top of the hierarchy of the state, and then company will accept. I will be in a very good, and I go up. But if I think what gives me more status is to be the leader of the company, then I will be not so hard on the fines, on the enforcement, and then maybe this can change the way of the antitrust enforcement in China, if that trend or with different companies. And this thing about being able to manage the secrecy or the publicity of the investigations in a good way, like without leaking things and the press. It's a good weapon. Like if you are, I think if you have the ability to do that, you have a very good weapon. And so we learned a lot. Thank you very much, Angela. Your book's fantastic. I hope we can discuss more topic on a future event. And thank you very much.
Thank you both for inviting me, and I have wonderful time. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed. Thank you, and thanks for everybody to watch.